My name is Luke Timmerman. I'm the founder and editor of Timmerman Report, a biotech industry newsletter, and the author of a new book called Hood, Trailblazer of the Genomics Age. And it's a biography of Lee Hood, one of the first generation scientific entrepreneurs in biotech, led the team that developed the first automated DNA sequencer. So I've been thinking a lot about entrepreneurship in science throughout people's lives and throughout history. And so it's a real pleasure to be here today with the next generation of biotech entrepreneurs who are looking at the industry with a fresh set of eyes, some of the things that maybe could use some improvement, and they've got their own ideas on aspects of the industry that they can work on. So to kind of set the stage for today's talk, I thought, we're at this really interesting moment in biotech history where the science is accelerating very rapidly. You've heard all about CRISPR-Cas as the new genome engineering technology. There's a lot of interesting things going on in immunotherapy, gene therapy. The automated DNA sequencing keeps getting better, faster, cheaper. And yet, there are some challenges in the pharmaceutical industry. These techniques are not necessarily translating into greater R&D productivity. In fact, there's a term that goes around, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, called Eroom's Law. It's the opposite of Moore's Law, and it's what applies in the pharmaceutical development business, where instead of benefiting from exponential development in, say, semiconductors that give rise to the supercomputers that you have in your pocket, we're in a position where drug development doesn't really have the capability to harness all of the technologies that are coming together. So it's still extremely time-consuming, expensive, and high-risk proposition. It's just about the most difficult thing humans do to develop a new drug and get it all the way through the FDA. And that challenge, that fundamental problem with the R&D of the pharmaceutical business model is something that people have been wrestling with for years. If you think about biotech history, as I alluded to at the beginning, Genentech was the trailblazing biotech company, 1980. It was a Netscape moment in the stock market when they went from $35 to $80. Great excitement around recombinant DNA technology as this new means for a new type of drug development with protein drugs, not just those small molecules that you can pop as a pill. And everybody wanted to apply this in the mode of what was called then a FIBCO, a fully integrated biopharmaceutical company. And that meant everything from drug discovery, basic science, exploration of genes and cells, all the way up through clinical trial development and manufacturing, marketing, all under one roof. Fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of investors looked at this and said, this is still too expensive. We're not getting as many drugs as we thought. It's taking longer. And so something needed to give. And that gave rise to the outsourcing movement. There was a great shift in the business model toward more outsourced activities. Pharmaceutical companies may do one piece of, say, manufacturing, marketing, but not, they would have somebody else do a lot of the fundamental functions. And that's still, we're in that phase, but it's still not yielding the productivity gains that people are looking for. So I am very curious to hear from our folks today on what they're doing to, I guess, bring about something like, think of it as like the cloud computing of biotech. What will be that thing or a combination of things that can get us out of this rut and make it so that we can more predictively develop new drugs in a lower risk, lower cost, faster fashion. So who wants to start? Why don't we start with Ethan on the end here. Ethan Perlstein, You have an interesting background here with a terrific academic pedigree, but looked around at the world of academic medicine and said, there's not a whole lot of opportunity here. Maybe I'm going to have to chart my own course with a public benefit corporation. It's different than a classic for-profit. Tell us about that.
Sure. So my story is I came out of the post-apocalypse. There's a lot of people like me who get training in life sciences, get a PhD in life sciences, and then often have to do this postdoctoral fellowship. And there's just way too many of us being trained for the number of academic positions that are open. So I encountered this problem. I encountered it 5 years ago. It's still raging to this day. And so it forced me into what's plan B? Because I had never thought about doing anything than being a professor. And actually taking to Twitter, I was able to rebuild a professional network outside of academia and started to meet a lot of patient advocates. And that's really what the genesis of Perlara, my company, can be traced back to. And so what we do at Perlara is we're the first personalized drug discovery platform, partnering directly with highly motivated families to cure diseases thought too rare to matter. And so the innovation that I've discovered is really that if you partner with patients, and it's not really that surprising, if you partner with patients, good things will happen. And so our model is really about democratized venture philanthropy and offering patient groups, and that could be a single motivated family who just got a diagnosis of a rare disease for a child or a family member, and allowing them the opportunity to fund their own R&D. And CRISPR, as you alluded to earlier, is enabling the sort of cost barrier to do personalized research to go down. And so combination of working directly with patient advocates, with CRISPR as sort of this preclinical research tool, allowing you now to make disease models that had not been possible before, that really all is combined together in what we're doing at Perlara.
Now, you mentioned the rare disease communities very, very quickly. I mean, the internet is absolutely an earthquake to all kinds of businesses. And drug development is one of them too, because here you have, for the first time, capability of patients and their families, small groups of people scattered all over the world who never would have known the other people like them existed somewhere. They can now mobilize on the internet, find a researcher like Ethan or his little company that's working on this, and start working together.
I call it sort of an analogy to economies of scale. Talk about economies of rare. So things that would seem totally unscalable, right? You have all these different groups, patients scattered geographically, scattered socioeconomically, yet they have to come together to form a disease community to do something about what is an incurable disease. So I have economies of rare.
Okay, so speaking of the internet, Elizabeth, you have a different way of harnessing this new collaboration technology, science exchange. You're talking about reducing the friction around outsourcing. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I guess from our perspective, it's about making sure that people can connect with the right experts without any of the challenges or friction associated with that process. So definitely I saw in my own experience as a researcher significant challenges with managing the process of working with the best people in the world outside your organization. And so our goal with Science Exchange is to provide a software platform that connects any company with thousands of experts without having to go through separate qualification and contracting with all of those as individuals. So it greatly reduces the friction and allows people to truly be able to work instantly with the best experts in the world.
And I think you said earlier that the big pharma companies typically have, something like 500 or 1,000 different vendors scattered around the world that they lean on for different aspects of the drug R&D business. And every one of them has a 20 or 100-page contract associated with such, and you are streamlining that, making that process easier. Once you've decided this is the firm you want to use, you can start working tomorrow.
Yep, that's right.
Excellent. Great. So I don't necessarily need to go straight down the line, but Alice, I know that you've got this terrific background in systems biology, and you're now applying it at Verge Genomics to help us, if I understand correctly, to get a better molecular definition of the diseases that we are talking about. So this is part of bringing out greater efficiency in R&D. We have this thing called Alzheimer's. It might be 10 different diseases within that great umbrella. We have some clinical sense of what Alzheimer's is. We've got some better technologies for imaging brains, which can help separate, say, Alzheimer's from other forms of dementia. But there's still a lot of work to be done here in the molecular definitions of that pathology. And you need that in order to develop effective drugs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So my story was that I was an MD PhD at UCLA doing neuroscience and genomics, and just became really frustrated with the way I saw pharmaceutical companies developing drugs in neuroscience, which is, really spending billions of dollars screening millions of drugs in these brute force screening experiments. And so I saw a huge opportunity to leverage this massive amount of genomic and genetic data to take the serendipity out of drug discovery and to pinpoint the genes that were causing disease and to predict drugs on the computer. And during my PhD, I started writing software to find new drugs for nerve regeneration. And within the course of months, was able to identify a compound that helped mice recover function of their legs after injury about 4 times faster than the leading standard. And I remember I had this aha moment when there was a postdoc that was sharing a bench with me and employing the standard brute force screening methods. He screened over 10,000 compounds, took him over 4 years. At the end of the 4 years, none of them had any effect. And so I started realizing there might be some real predictive power in using data and software to streamline the drug discovery process, and was about 3 months away from graduating my PhD, decided to leave, to the anger of my family, who are now happy with me, hopefully.
What did they want you to do or expect you to do?
Like any Chinese parents, they wanted me to be a doctor,
Uh-huh.
I guess. But I always say I got half of two doctorates, so I'm basically a full doctor. But yeah, so now we're a team. We started a year and a half ago. We're a team of 12 PhDs. Spanning anywhere from applied math, statistics, computer science, but also experts in neuroscience and drug development. And it's really important that we think going forward about how do we streamline R&D. It's really important that we put the computer scientists and the biologist and the drug development veterans really in one room, and that's been key to our success.
Great. So last but not least, D.A. Wallach on the end. I think of D.A., you're sort of like a Renaissance man.
Man.
We don't have too many of them around, but scholar, musician, now kind of omnivorous intellectual investor in various forms of tech and biotech. How did you hit upon this idea that maybe you should work on investing in biotech?
Well, my sort of adult life began in a rock band that I started my freshman year of college. And when I was 21, we got a record deal. I moved out to LA and spent a few years touring and making records full time. And sort of progressively became bored with the life of living in a bus, which I thought was more glamorous than it turned out to be. And so look to investing as a vocation to sort of re-engage with my intellectual interests. And I thought it was a great field for me to go into professionally because it would basically allow me to turn being a dilettante into an asset and not a liability. And so for the past 6 or 7 years, I've sort of circulated through various economies in the world trying to understand where technology was changing human life in the most important ways. And that led me from media, my first investment was Spotify, to SpaceX, just obviously doing space exploration, eventually colonization, hopefully, to then coming to believe over the past 2 or 3 years that health and the life sciences were the places where we would see the most important changes over the next several decades. And so there are 2 or 3 reasons I'm sort of drawn to this area. And I began making a handful of investments in healthcare delivery, IT services, anything that would decrease the inefficiencies in our delivery system, and quite specifically in the US, although very interested in technologies that can be universalized, because the biggest story of the next century has to be several billion people sort of joining the party. And they all deserve great health care and great education, all these other basic amenities as well. So the 2 things that sort of converged in drawing me into biotech were, one, that I fell in love with the scientists I was meeting, and found in these people a sort of artistic kinship that I wasn't finding in other areas of technology. Something really that grabbed me was the sense that there were these geniuses toiling away in various labs, discovering interesting things, but who sort of found the soft skill side of it harder. The telling a story, raising capital, packaging what they do to capital markets. And that's stuff that I'm relatively good at. And so as an investor, my goal is to deploy capital to the most important areas of human innovation, and this seemed like an area where people actually needed help. Like there was actually an absence of the capital that was commensurate with the quality of ideas and the vastness of ideas that were out there. And then the second thing was that it strikes me that we are at, I don't know where we are in this inflection point. It might be a 50-year transition, so easy to, sort of jump the gun on it or be late. But fundamentally, our relationship to biology is changing. And we'll ultimately see that materialize in areas outside of healthcare with the greatest impact. Ultimately, we'll have biological communications technologies, but that may be 100 years off. But today, we're going to start seeing this shift in our relationship with biological engineering fundamentally revolutionize the way we treat disease and think about health. And so that's an exciting thing to be alive to watch. And I've just found myself extremely excited about trying to help hasten it.
Very interesting. So, well, I don't know if we're able to talk 100 years out on this panel, but what do each of you see? Do you see anything happening in the next 5 or 10 years to improve that R&D productivity challenge, to make it so that we can, with more predictability, shorter time frame, less amount of capital, get all the way through to good FDA-approved drugs?
Yeah, I think where the key to really improving R&D productivity is investing in earlier innovation and failing earlier in the process. And I think the problem in the field right now for pharmaceutical companies is that they've really moved away from investing, at least internally, in that. Many of them have moved to become more later and later in the process, some of them even as primarily distribution and marketing channels. And I think that I'm biased, but I do think that technology does have a huge role in streamlining that. We, as a company, have been able to get off the ground with very little capital. We've raised about $4 million total. I've spent only $1.5 million to launch not only our own internal therapeutic programs, but help pharmaceutical companies advance drugs all the way to phase 1 clinical trials in bipolar disorder. However, I do think that there needs to be more funding in the area. I think either of smaller companies or academic labs that are really working on the risky innovation. And I think that both, whether or not that's government funding or private venture funding, they need to be moving at the pace that these companies are moving in terms of thinking creatively. I see this company that sits at the intersection perfectly of software and life sciences. How do I think about this company that looks nothing like what we knew before? This is not a pure product, a pure play life sciences. I can't assess the value of the company simply by looking at what its lead asset is, how close is it to IND, and assessing the returns there. But on the technology side, I think we have a lot of space to grow for investors, really looking at, hey, the big vision here is therapeutics, and that sounds scary, but we need to invest in it because this is how you have software really start to transform pharmaceutical companies, by actually having the companies start to look more like pharma companies rather than just software companies.
So you want to develop drugs, but you don't want to spend $2 billion to do it.
That's the idea. Yeah.
You shouldn't have to. You mentioned private venture capital, government sources, foundations, venture philanthropies are stepping in. Seems like there's some things that are kind of messed up in how we finance biotech. I mean, the venture capital club, if you will, it's a pretty small club, and they don't often like to back anyone under the age of 40. With gray hair. They don't like people with hoodies. Nobody's wearing a hoodie up here, that's good. But there's a real conservatism in the business, both at the big pharma companies, but that the venture capital group. And now we're beginning to see some different phenotypes of investors come along. What hope does that provide?
So I mean, all of Elizabeth and Alice are all part of Y Combinator. So I think that's one antidote to the ossification and kind of broification, I think, of VCs, especially as they've kind of given up on the seed stage. I would imagine sort of milestones that a Series A biotech Series A investor would have had 10 years ago. Now that you have to do almost like twice as much data to be able to get that money, and so they've completely sort of abandoned this early stage. But then folks like Y Combinator, not traditional life science investors, see the opportunity and fill into this space. And then our personal thesis is that venture philanthropy will continue to democratize. And so you're going to have funding sources coming directly from not just sort of traditional foundations, but patient groups that are constituting themselves as LLCs even. We're partnering with a group that created an LLC because it was faster to do that than to go through the 501c3 accreditation process. So I think you've got obviously non-traditional investors coming in, and then of course patient groups down to the single family are mobilizing funds in creative ways and deploying it in creative ways.
Yeah, there's a long tradition in this country of people who care about a disease in making donations, charitable contributions to biomedical research centers. And it makes some sense for that to naturally extend into the more applied nature of the business, where maybe they can take a piece of equity along the way for supporting a still risky but promising new technology or individual drug asset. How do you think about this, DA? I mean, you're investing alongside some of these new people at the table, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, so I'm a little unqualified to speak about investing in therapeutics since I've never done so. I have invested in a handful of companies in healthcare delivery and also in what I would consider tools for discovery. But the scary thing about therapeutics is, of course, the business model. The time scales are really long, they're extremely capital intensive, and the risk is totally concentrated. So the question that I'm sort of fixated on is the technology going to change any of that? And has this ever been a good business for anyone to be in a sort of predictable sense? It's not to say that people haven't probabilistically lucked out on the right thing after taking a bunch of shots, but does anyone really know better than anyone else what's going to work long term? And so I sort of step back and think about it in the following way, which is what as a civilization we need is for the brightest people with the most creative ideas and the best tools to get the capital they need to have a canvas that they can paint on. And if we do that, then our chances of success go up considerably vis-a-vis the alternatives. And so I think my question is, can we, over the next 20 or 30 years, develop tools that allow us to break some of the fundamental characteristics that make this a sort of bad industry? In particular, the glaring one, and this is like an extremely naive sounding thing to say, but the glaring thing that you see when you come in as an idiot who doesn't know this field is that the only way to find out if stuff works is to use it in people and to get great data. And that's a fundamental problem that we have. It's inherently extraordinarily expensive. So from a technological standpoint, my primary interest is in finding ways of circumventing that. And it may be a fool's errand, but in particular, one of my investments is a company called Emulate that recently announced a partnership with the FDA. Emulate's taking a shot at this with organs on chips, little microfluidic organ models that would allow us in a more reliable, repeatable way to test things without having to do them in vivo. And ultimately, if we can get closer to recapitulating human biology without people, that will be a path to reducing the cost. So I'm looking at the tools that, if we systematically invest with them, might allow us to crack the big problem.
Organ on a chip is one good example. So you could have, say, a model human kidney or liver, and take your experimental drug and test it against that to see, is it too toxic?
Yeah.
And if so, you can throw that one away and move on to the next very quickly. But then eventually, you're still going to need to go through animal models and then go into people and see what happens when it gets into the amazingly complicated symphony that we are.
And that's the foil always is the complexity of living things. They're extraordinary. And so there's merit in investing in silico technologies, in statistical predictive technologies, in vitro model systems like Emulates. The story that can sometimes be naively framed as a news story about computers changing everything is a story that's been unfolding since the 60s. So if you go read Norbert Wiener and you look at the cybernetics dudes who were trying to simulate complex ecological systems in the 60s, they thought they were 3 years away from cracking it and being able to run these models in computers and have it tell you exactly what was going to happen. We're still nowhere close to that. If anything, we've just been humbled the closer we try to get, because every new tool we get, in fact, seems to make things more complicated. It gives us more data to manage. So, but it doesn't make it an unworthy enterprise. And so I think it's, extremely necessary that young, creative people keep trying these things that, the jaded old guys get tired of and say, it never works, we've seen it 4 times.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, I think there's, in some ways, actually trying to move quicker into humans is actually probably a way to reduce the cost, because the complexity of the human system is very difficult to model. And so actually we've kind of taken a swing in the other direction, where we require extensive preclinical data before we go into clinical studies, and that process actually delays the ability to do quick proof of concept studies in humans. And some of the most successful examples of very cost-effective drug development are places like Chorus, which was an organization that worked with Eli Lilly to very quickly and cost-effectively do rapid proof of concept in humans with a secondary endpoint that was just, does this drug actually modulate the biochemical activity of the target in the person, rather than looking for an efficacy effect. And then they could quickly eliminate, so that kind of idea that Alice said about failing really fast, they could quickly eliminate things that don't work in humans the way that we had anticipated from the animal model.
I mean, I think to add to that point, I think from my perspective, it's not so much about replacing human trials so much as de-risking them. And so you can imagine if you're going to a clinical trial and you have 100% certainty that it's going to pass, I mean, it's worth investing $100 million to do that clinical trial if you're going to get to a drug that has annual revenues of $10 billion in the case of Alzheimer's disease. But I think it's because right now we are not even using any human data. We're not testing in patient-derived cells for efficacy until we actually get to phase 2. Most drugs are only tested in artificial animal models. In neuroscience, what does it mean for a mouse to have Alzheimer's disease? And so I think there's just this big gap in predictiveness of the preclinical models with when we're actually testing clinically, that in neuroscience leads to an over 95% attrition rate from phase 2 to phase 3. And that's where all the capital is going, really, is in the failures, not so much the successes.
And it's very difficult to know whether the animal models are not predictive or whether the quality of the original experiments was not sufficient, right? So there's a lot of evidence now that many studies that are published are not reproducible. So actually the models may be predictive of failure, but they just unfortunately, weren't conducted in a way that could be reproduced.
I wonder, this would be to the biologists on the panel, I think you all agree, biology is hard. It's complicated, much more so than we think. But we have seen success stories when the biology is really well worked out. PCSK9, I don't know how many people here know that story, but this was a case of a human genetic knockout. Essentially, a researcher in Texas found that there are people walking around with extremely low cholesterol who happen to have a deleted form of this gene called PCSK9, and they're otherwise healthy and fine. So that begs the question now, if you could somehow modulate that with a targeted drug, could you deliver that result, which is extremely low cholesterol, for lots more people? And that did play out. It was much faster, much cheaper, and with a much higher degree of success. 2 companies won FDA approval for drugs of that nature. And so, I mean, what's the lesson from that? Is there something we can generalize?
I would think so. I mean, Perlara focuses on diversifying risk of disease models by using many different models, human cells, simple animals. That's sort of we think the simplest answer to complexity is simply by hedging and including more models. That's been our approach. But I think the PCSK9 story is an example, as more genomes come online, just because newborns are getting sequenced, people are getting sequenced, and it's just going to be something you have with you. That is going to be the source of all these connections, right? right? You're going to find the natural human experiment was done. This person is a knockout and has the following set of phenotypes. It's protected from something. There might be a downside. They might have an Achilles heel that we don't appreciate, but I think the formula is look for people who are natural human experiments that show you that you can exist with an extreme phenotype that ends up being protective. And so those connections will just continue to pile on as more genomes come online and as we know to look for them. And you don't necessarily have to, I mean, you can go prospecting for it and look for individuals that you think have phenotypes that are going to be the hallmarks that they might have some interesting sort of molecular characteristic. But I think otherwise, just the natural increase in the number of genomes will just produce these connections.
So now we're really talking about precision medicine. This is a term that a lot of people have heard. And you think back to the Human Genome Project and the way that was sold to the public, we were going to get a whole bunch of miracle cures, and that did not happen in the first 10 or so years. But what I hear you saying, Ethan, is that now that we have benefited from some exponential rate of progress, better, faster, cheaper DNA sequencing, we're going to get more and more of these genomes that we can compare. We can really do some comparative analysis. What's perturbed here with these people, and what might be able to work with in a drug development perspective. So is it maybe a matter of time? Like we're just kind of on that verge where we're going to start reaping the benefits from the genomics wave?
I think the major realization of the genomics revolution is the problem and the bottleneck is not generating data. It's how do we analyze all of this data out there. There are over 2 million publicly available gene expression data sets out there right now. That number doubles every single year. So the realization is that it's not just a problem of guess and check right now. Drug discovery is largely a large-scale data analysis issue. And we mine and scrape a lot of publicly available data. You go onto these download statistics, and only 5 people have ever downloaded them. And it's pretty shocking and surprising. And a lot of people, they ask me, oh, this data is available. Why can't anyone do it? The fact of the matter is there's very few people that can actually figure out how to integrate this data. And you get a lot of, from pharma with the PSK-C9 story, a lot of pharma companies keep saying, now we need to use this data to find genetically supported targets. We need human biology in there. But none of them actually know how to leverage all of this data to get to that testable hypothesis, to get to that gene target, and to how to develop that into a drug. And so why we've had so much success and traction, not only with pharma companies, but in our internal drug development, is that we have put in the effort to really bring on some of the world's only talent that can actually integrate all of this data and drive it towards a single gene or a single target that we can drug. And that, I think, is not to be underestimated.
I think related to that, there are some really good examples where it's extremely important to have very good phenotypic data associated with the genetic data sets, and that's actually one of the fundamental parts that's really missing. So Amgen is the perfect example where they invested billions of dollars acquiring Decode, which essentially is that data set, right? Like it's all of the genetic sequences of the whole Icelandic population and all of their phenotypic medical records plus all of their family history in terms of actual lineage.
They can connect the dots.
Yeah,
you have a gene mutation here, and it leads to X in your
And they've
health.
done it many times now, and I think it's very interesting, that data set, but it is a very unique asset that they hold.
That's something that we don't have here in the US, partly as a function of our healthcare delivery system. These genomic data sets live in their own silos, and they're not really connected to people's medical records. People shift around insurance, switch jobs. How you put these things together is very difficult. Google, or Verily, is now taking on this challenge with what they call their baseline project, trying to going forward. Mm-hmm. Alice, I think I want to build on something you just said about not many people knowing how to, or downloading the data that's there. We're generating a lot of data. We are in this information gathering phase, but turning it into actual useful knowledge, very difficult. What's the rate limiter there? Is this a matter of training? Should we be training more people in bioinformatics or something else?
Yeah, it's pretty surprising. I think another way this is reflected is when we work with academic labs. We've been able to build now the largest data set in ALS, simply by working with labs and realizing they have all these data sets that are just sitting on their servers, unpublished, because they spent millions generating this data, but haven't thought through what they're actually going to do with it. And so the first is underestimating the difficulty of taking data, processing it, and doing the right analysis to extract something useful from it. The second big rate limiting factor is that computer scientists and biologists are still very much siloed, even within academia. And there's very little crosstalk. So usually how bioinformaticians work is that they'll produce a ranked list of genes that are changing the most, pass it on to the biologists. The computer scientists don't even understand what's the question being asked. The biologists just get this list of genes. They're like, okay, I'm just going to choose the number one gene on there. And because there's very few people that really are either sitting next to a biologist, a computer scientist, and really interacting to understand what is the biological question being asked here. And importantly, how do we actually test it? How do we predict a hypothesis, test it in lab, and have that feedback into the analysis and really close the loop? And so I would say that's probably the major bandwidth limiter for actually turning data into something useful.
You have a view on this, Ethan?
Well, I think definitely think training is one of the challenges here. And I did my postdoc at Princeton, and Princeton set up a curriculum that was called Integrated Sciences. And the idea was that they would teach folks who wanted to end up being biology PhDs, but presumably they wanted to teach them and reinforce calculus in actual scientific problems, not just some toy exercise they did in their AP class. They're also taught to code in their first year. And this is talked about as a big experiment in trying to reunify biologists with their former quantitative selves, because the first molecular biologists were all expats from physics.
Right.
And so there was no question about, can the biologists do the analysis? That they were the same person back in the day, and that was lost. And some efforts are like Princeton are trying to reverse that, but I've got to say I do notice that if you look at CVs coming, the resumes coming to us, I'll notice gradually over the past few years an uptick in the number of people who will list that they can code, list that they can do analysis on their own. I don't think it's happening fast enough, but I think the real bottleneck is the graduate institution and training programs are not unifying the quantitative and the qualitative halves like they did once upon a time.
So we do hear some about Silicon Valley and software is going to come along and eat biology is one phrase I think Andreessen Horowitz uses. We have biologists on the panel, and I suspect that you don't think it's going to be that easy. But where can the software be useful?
Well, I think there are definitely folks who are much more skeptical, maybe more sort of traditional Boston-based folks are maybe more skeptical of that model. But yeah, I think ultimately, Silicon Valley has a lot to offer in terms of the legacy of investing, venture culture, data science culture, obviously. So we need to make room at the party. I think right now there's kind of this coastalism happening sometimes, where you've got Silicon Valley doesn't know what they're doing. They can make apps, but they can't make drugs, and the life science folks are very proud of themselves and think that they're doing just fine. So I'd like to see more actual getting together as opposed to sort of lobbing bombs over the wall to each other saying, well, we can out-innovate you or you're all hype, and we can have that cycle go on forever.
You have a view on this, DA? Being a little closer to maybe the software world?
Yeah, I think there is a considerable naivety. I'm sure most of the folks on this panel read Bruce Booth's post a couple weeks ago or something. I thought that was a sort of decisive answer to this question. He makes the point that essentially all these folks have no idea what they're doing, and they're chasing something that has been tried before and failed, and that like the insight that biology is now a systems problem and a computational problem is 20 years old, and plenty of people have walked down that path. I think to Alice's point, though, there still is a sort of cultural gap between the computer science and the biology. And whereas the last sort of century was about chemistry, this century will pretty clearly be about computation. It's not a unique thing to biology. Computers and network computing has infiltrated every single industry and is going to continue to do so. So I heard someone say a couple days ago, like, what do you think of the internet? Overrated short-term, but underrated long-term. And I think the same is true of computational biology and systems biology and these sort of frameworks that are now native to the generation that's coming out of PhD programs. The other thing that's great about Silicon Valley sort of taking the bait on this is that no one gets that hurt if they're wrong. A bunch of rich people lose their money. And that's kind of the worst that happens. But in the meantime, all of these creative PhDs can go and make a bunch of money and take a swing at it, and in the past, as sort of Ethan described, they would be left orphaned by the society. So I think it's a great thing. And, there will be some interesting things that come out of these fundings, and there will be some disappointments.
Well, in the case of healthcare, while people try to figure stuff out and are floundering, the patients still have their need. So people are clamoring for progress.
Yeah, I think that's true. What Silicon Valley has sort of progressively figured out, I went through this awakening myself as well, was you look at the healthcare system here and you think there are just so many problems that would be easy to fix, essentially. That it's just, if you just got a smart person to chase that for 4 years, they could do a good job on it. The thing you realize is that it's really a people problem. The challenges are these weird organizations and institutions we've built, hospitals, health systems, insurance companies, the regulatory regimes that govern them. Those are the hard things to navigate. So we need as much innovation around business model and delivery system as we do in the actual science of medicine.
Let's talk about those business models, because everybody here is in some kind of non-traditional or startup, ambiguous, kind of uncertain sort of organization, myself included. Thinking about the talented people from the past, like my biography subject, Lee Hood, 1970, he's 32 years old, he gets a faculty job at Caltech. He embarks on a research career as a tenure-track faculty at a moment when the NIH budget was about to triple in the decade of the 1970s. Like, there were a lot of things lining up to pursue that kind of career. Now, this is not the path you've all chosen. You're also not working in a big company that posts, openings for a senior director of biology or a VP of biology with a list of 20 requirements that require 20 years of experience to ever get. So you can't really go get a job like that at Merck. They don't even have like a good way to let you get that foot in the door. So here we are. You're starting stuff, starting new things. Is this the right way to do it? I mean, is this where you think you can have the biggest impact? At this moment in time, given the forces that you see out there in the market and the types of organizations and how they behave?
So so Perlara is constituted as a public benefit corp. You had brought that up in the beginning, Luke, and I didn't really expand on that. But essentially, you can think about C corps here and 501c3s here. Public benefit corps are a for-profit, but you have extra language in your articles of incorporation that say we're not just ruthlessly maximizing profitability, we're also balancing a social and environmental mission, and you can define the social and environmental mission in the articles of incorporation. But it's up to ultimately shareholders to be activists and say, we have to hold you to account. So our business model says in a climate where there's a lot of hostility to pharma, there's a lot of anger, drug pricing, a lot of anger about, or sometimes also people are a little confused that yes, we live in a capitalist world, that includes healthcare, and people are shocked to find this out, apparently. But clearly there is a desire for a different direction. And so we believe that, kind of tapping into that moment, this was already 4 years ago, we decided to become a PBC, and I think it's starting to bear fruit today in terms of, the only other PBC I know in the pharma space is called Trek Therapeutics, and they're competing with Gilead in Hep C, and their whole mandate is that we want to deliver these drugs cheaper. And that's really our mandate as a public benefit corp. So I see that model as blossoming. Right now you see a lot of PBCs and B Corps generally in the consumer space, consumer-facing things, breweries, bakeries, not necessarily in pharma, but I believe that we are sort of at the crest of a coming wave that's very much needed.
Cool. So for me, I never in a million years thought I would be an entrepreneur, never thought I'd start a company. I was very much thought I'd go down that path of becoming a professor, running my own lab, doing the 80-20 split. But for me, it was a confluence of factors that led me to start the company. The first is that I was publishing the work I did in drug discovery and had this realization, I'm just going to publish this, and then what? Who is going to push it out into something that impacts patients? And if it wasn't going to be me, part of the learning from my PhD is, there are actually very few people in the world that are better suited to do this. And the second is I was going through the medical school and the academic tracks, realized that in medical school you could see, and as a doctor you can see one patient at a time, and that's very fulfilling, but there's a fundamental ceiling to the upside you can create in your lifetime. And as a PhD, you can certainly make a massive discovery that impacts millions, but the reality of the day-to-day are not aligned with the patients. People very much care about career advancement, publishing, et cetera. And for me, the ultimate reason I went into the MD PhD was to impact as many people as I could in my lifetime using scientific innovation. And it's been a surprise to me that starting a company has really fulfilled that much more than either track could.
Elizabeth, can you talk about your switch from academia to entrepreneurship?
Yeah. I mean, I actually was an assistant professor before I started Science Exchange, so I was on that path to being, a traditional academic, but again, really seeing the opportunity to have much more impact in terms of creating an efficient system that allowed people to really get their research conducted with the best experts was an opportunity that I felt would, ultimately impact many more research programs than I could run myself.
How many companies are using the Science Exchange now?
So we actually work with over 1,000 companies. So we have scientists from over 1,000 companies that use Science Exchange. So definitely seeing, very broad section of research and development being conducted through the platform.
And the trend, I think, is your friend.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that, I would expect that number to be much higher next year. So I want to leave some time for questions. What questions do you have for the audience? Yeah, Margaret.
Do you have a microphone for you? All right, I'm going to put you guys on the spot because I think you represent a different generation than probably a lot of the leadership of major companies, particularly in the life sciences. DA, we had a fun conversation a year ago where you were blaming the baby boomers for basically all problems in the world. So being a boomer
At least you guys
trapped,
gave us a great president, though.
right,
Yeah.
being a boomer trapped in a millennial body or vice versa, I want to put you guys on the spot and say, what's your advice to all the major life science companies out there? We've talked about the divide between the two coasts. What do you think they need to be doing more of?
I'd say stop price gouging. That would be a good one to start.
I would say diversity. I'd like to see gender-balanced C-suites. I think if you care, you can do it. Perlara is majority women, and half the pool of PhD applicants are women coming from life sciences. So in this industry, it's time to actually start walking the walk.
Well, I think they can, for pharma companies, right now they're on a trajectory to disaster, right? Like their R&D productivity is declining and their cost of buying an innovation is increasing. So those two things cannot continue. So the way I see it is they have to think really differently about where their innovation comes from. They need to create systems where young people, both within their company but also from outside their company, have opportunities to take great ideas and develop them, and then they'll actually have a pipeline that's sustainable that they can build off.
I agree with a lot of what Elizabeth just said. I think a lot of pharma companies like to pay lip service to the fact that they support innovation, they are into human genomics, but in reality, they're not putting the capital behind that and not making the investment. And the way they are realistically running their process is still very much the same as it was 10 years ago. So I think really having big advocates for change at the top and really then making the leap to invest either within the company for innovation or outside the company, and being more open to what that innovation looks like, whether or not it's a young female CEO or someone that looks like them. I think there needs to be a lot more openness and breaking down of barriers.
I would agree totally with what you said and what Elizabeth said, which is that they should embrace the role of being the kingmakers and the sugar daddies of a really vibrant and diverse ecosystem at the grassroots. So to the extent that economies of scale, like you could have in a large integrated pharmaceutical company in the past, are no longer necessarily what differentiates success from failure, it might be that for bioinformatics PhDs with great computational skills can do interesting stuff in Palo Alto. They should be supporting that environment. And Silicon Valley or the traditional Boston venture organizations are now capitalizing that ecosystem, but Big Pharma could be. And for the foreseeable future, they're going to be the ones with the biggest checkbooks, and they're going to be responsible for determining when and if people can ever achieve liquidity. The venture investors will burn out on this space if they come to the conclusion that they have to wait 10 years for returns. And Big Pharma is the only answer to that.
They've got plenty of cash, and it doesn't actually take that much cash to invest in basic research intelligently. I would add that they could stand arm in arm with the NIH and say we need to continue funding the NIH long term. Other questions? No? I'm shocked. What kind of response have you gotten from your peer networks to going the road less traveled, I guess you could say, doing things a little differently than taking that faculty job or going to work in industry, starting out as an entrepreneur? Does that, your advisors okay with this? Your peers, are they supportive? Not?
When I first left, I was very public about the post-apocalypse and about my troubles on the job market, and a lot of other people have been since. And so I was very open, and kind of Twitter was my support network, actually, in a lot of ways, because other academics, other trainees could provide support that way. Yeah, I would say my advisors was a little bit, the advice I got was, after I finished the first postdoc, best advice I got from one of my letter writers was, why don't you try another postdoc? And I was like, yeah, no. That was sort of the breaking point. But I think PIs or principal investigators, lab heads, are generally getting better. And when I reach out to them nowadays, especially when we're trying to recruit, I know that my email's being forwarded. I'm getting requests from trainees that are interested in biotech, interested in this kind of opportunity. So I think, obviously our peers are very supportive. Generationally, there could be some issues, but I think in general, the PIs, the younger PIs, are definitely with it.
I think for me, people were confused. That's the overarching word, just confusion. Didn't know how to deal with it. I think I came from UCLA. I left the program. That didn't make very many people happy at the time. My advisor, the program director, et cetera. And it was good. I have generally a mentality of just doing things, so it wasn't too impactful. But the university, interestingly enough, had never dealt with a situation in which a student actually leaves and starts a lab and recruits the investigator to be on the advisory board. They're more used to having a professor leave and then recruit their students. So they actually were quite confused, and in the end actually banned my advisor from being on our advisory board for conflict of interest reasons, which were confusing. So I do think that at the university level, there is a lot of room for growth in supporting young entrepreneurs to pursue alternative paths, particularly as the NIH budget is shrinking and there are fewer and fewer faculty jobs. You're going to have a lot of really young, smart scientists asking, what next? And they need to be open. There needs to be opportunities during a graduate training to either support that, not to stigmatize it, or to offer opportunities for getting those skill sets. Because if you're leaving your PhD with, you're like the world's best crystallographer, that's a skill set that isn't very applicable outside of just academia.
Yeah, if this is the reality of the way we want to fund things, with stagnant funding for basic biomedical research at universities, and with pharma and big biotech having a lot of money but being very conservative and kind of focused on late stage aspects of the business, then we've got a whole generation of scientific trainees that are coming out that need to go somewhere and put their training to productive use. And I think what I'm seeing very consistently out there is that entrepreneurship is it. There are people who want to fund people like you. You got to hustle. You got to find them. It's not easy.
Yeah, a lot of that funding goes to actually the established biotechs are really recruiting from executives within large pharma. So that's kind of the big trend you see, is that lots of established pharma players going and actually starting to be the CSO at a biotech company. So rather than us being those people, I think there's actually a lot more of the money going more towards that path. unfortunately.
Funny mission. I noticed, I think, Alice, you have a CSO who is a very experienced individual. And does that give your investors a certain degree of comfort? That, well, geez, I'm not backing some, 31-year-old in a hoodie. No disrespect.
Yeah, no, I like bringing him along to some of our investor meetings because there's a noticeable change in body language. Sometimes I notice. I usually have him. I'm like, okay, Tony, go and do your impressive pharma pitch. He's like, I created Abilify, like best, highest grossing drug in schizophrenia on market. And I was like, oh wow, that's amazing. And then often I notice this dynamic where, I will answer a question, I'll say something, and there's just general confusion in the room, like people don't quite understand it, and he will say the exact same thing, and everyone's all of a sudden like, oh wow, it makes a lot of sense. It's like, that's why I hired you. I'm just kidding.
We may be touching on some gender issues, and that's probably another panel there. Another question here in the middle.
Yeah, here's a microphone for you, sir. Morning. This is a great panel. Thank you so much. I'm curious. There's an opportunity here to really change a lot of cultural established norms, and I think that this group really represents that. The government itself is actually a very interesting place. There's the NIH, of course, which is a tremendous place. There was another agency, DARPA, that actually was very important in the Emulate story. And so there, the philosophy is a little different, right? There's a little bit of change in philosophy there, and I'm curious to see what the panel thinks in terms of, we talk about changing culture somewhat, but also in terms of fundamentally changing philosophy. The NIH is a good example. The NIH is not heavily engaged in the startup world. And there's the NCAP, which is a very small amount of money relative to the $30 billion they have. And you're absolutely correct. It's a fairly flat funding opportunity, but how do you then leverage the money? I mean, we all want more money. So I'm just curious in terms of the philosophy aspect of it, what you, in your perspective, see as an opportunity space to engage certainly perhaps the best place to get undilutive capital, which is the government.
Well, there is a mechanism for obtaining that funding. So there is SBIR grants, which are 3% of the budget, which does go towards startups. And unfortunately, they had a very strange philosophy up until recently, which required anybody who had raised more than a certain amount of venture capital was not eligible for those programs. So more or less, they selected against the best companies to invest in. So I think they've now modified that, which probably will result in a better return on that. But there is that program, so there's one avenue there.
Well, and another aspect of that question, if I understand, is that the funding agencies themselves have a lot of power to affect change. So the Gates Foundation recently came out and said, if you're one of our grant recipients, you have to publish your results in the open.
I would also say, just on that question, just as a sort of credit to the government, like, as I am looking for cool new technologies that are sort of at the point of needing to be commercialized, DARPA is an incredible fountain of great stuff right now. And in particular, it's distinguished from the bioventure community in their willingness to embrace ideas that don't look like traditional business models. So, they've been terrific on bioelectronics work, on brain-computer interfaces, on simulation technologies like Emulate, and you just don't see that coming out of these farm club venture communities. You see it coming out of the government. It's really impressive.
The government may not be as hidebound as the rap says, but with that, I think we're out of time. Everybody, could we please thank our panelists for a great discussion?